My name is Marko Pajević. I'm together with Raili Marling, the organizer of this conference, but I won't really say much more of a greeting now, because for that we have our Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities, Selart, who was kind enough to take some time for us this morning to open officially this conference, and then Raili and I will do a bit more of an introduction before we start with the first speakers. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you. In the name of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, University of Tartu, I'll say you a very warm welcome. What about biopolitics and health? I'm a historian, so I have probably a bit different perspective to this topic we will discuss during these days. It's, as I see, mostly the question about responsibility. Who is responsible for things happen? Historically, the answer was quite simple and easy. It's a God. Nowadays, for some reason, we do not trust God anymore, and we are seeking for other answers. It's government, capitalism, reptiles, secret government, aliens, or whatever. The list of the possible answers is quite long. At the same time, as my colleague Bertel Piirimäe said in the context of vaccination debate, nowadays we are more and more thinking that our liberties are individual, but responsibility is collective. And in political discussions, the question of who is responsible is, as you know, more or less synonymous to question who is guilty. And when the government, for example, is guilty, then it's quite reasonable, especially before elections, to rule society in more detailed way to avoid the situations when the government will be guilty, or at least in the eyes of some media. So the biopolitics and regulation of health is a question where we actually should think not only individual responsibility or collective responsibility, but from my perspective as historian, more about general social and historical processes. But I'm quite sure that during these discussions, every possible aspect of the topic will be discussed. And so I wish you very enjoyable lectures and pleasant discussions. Thank you.
So welcome from me as well. So my name is Raili Marling, and I'm a professor of English studies here, and it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you in this room. We are first of all very happy that we have guests who have come from the United States, from Latvia, from Tallinn, because we have been missing so many academic events because of biopolitics, and it is great to meet together to discuss biopolitics. I think there is no more timely topic. We are very grateful for the people who have allowed us to make this event. First of all, we are grateful for the European Regional Development Fund through the ASPERA project that funds the graduate school, and they have sponsored the trips of many of our speakers, and also the participation of Marko here. We are grateful for the Estonian Research Council that has funded my project and that also contributes to this event. And finally, we are grateful, of course, to the Faculty of Humanities that allows us to have this very timely discussion in this venue today. And of course, many thanks for the students who signed up, because without you, we wouldn't have any reason to have these discussions, because we academics get to meet in other venues as well. But without you, this would not have that kind of a new spark to it. So welcome to everybody, and we hope that you will all be alert and responsive and active, because if you looked at the program, you can see that we have left lots of time for discussion, that we have longer papers than in a usual conference. We give 30 minutes per paper, and we leave 15 minutes for discussion. We organize the day in such a way that after each paper, there is discussion immediately, so keep your questions. Those people who are online can ask their questions through chat. Susanna will keep an eye on it. So be ready, be responsive, be alert. We help you stay alert with the coffee. So when you look at the program, you will see that after each session, there's coffee. We give you time to walk around at a lunch break, return to us. So there's the kind of an old classical model of conferencing, that we sit, we think, we walk, and we talk. So that's all that I would like to say, and I will return the microphone to Marko for more thorough introduction of the topic.
Thank you, Raili. Yeah, so I'm going to frame our conference a little bit and talk a little bit more about what biopolitics actually is, because that's quite an open question, and obviously it's not what we are going to discuss here from the humanities. Is not something like responsibilities or guilt even, but structures, social structures that lead to certain things, political structures and so on. So yes, we have quite a rich variety of topics and papers. So concerning the framework, I think we first have to say that in COVID-19 times, biopolitics is the topic par excellence and has obviously received much attention. The events surrounding the COVID-19 virus have led to previously unheard of biopolitical measures, resulting in deep and lasting transformations of our societies. Film and literature, however, have for decades suggested scenarios for pandemics and models of societies wherein health policy shapes political structure and common life. So this conference intends to shed light on how philosophical reflection and literature, so cultural representations, help us to better understand what our societies currently undergo. But what do we actually mean by biopolitics? A term used in very various ways, contexts and disciplines, and that is far from being one clearly defined concept. So the notion has been first used at the start of the 20th century in the context of the philosophy of life, based on thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Henri Bergson. Several thinkers adapted the idea of life as a basic category to the state. The Swede Rudolf Kjellén developed then an organicistic conception of the state as a living organism. It is evident that such approaches appealed to racists, and the Nazis used them amply to develop their ideology of the Volkskörper, so the body of the people, and a world completely based on biological causes. But also Stalin's communism wanted to build the new human being. And in the USA, as well as in many European countries, sterilization programs and other eugenic practices shared some ideas with these tendencies. So in 1938 then, the Englishman Morley Roberts had referred to biopolitics to describe the relevance and concepts from evolutionary theory for explaining political behavior. Also after World War II, biopoliticians developed various theories based on the idea of innate qualities. Another strand of biopolitics emerged then in the 1960s on the basis of ecological processes and looming ecological disaster. The growing population also invited mostly right-wing thinkers to use biopolitics to develop strategies against overpopulation or mixing of races. So starting with the 1970s, then technological innovations such as the beginning genetic engineering also called for a regulation of such scientific processes and progress. So while biopolitics evidently is historically not a clearly defined term, for what is at stake at this conference, clearly Michel Foucault's influential but vague enough definition serves as the basis for all theories of biopolitics after him, and also with what we are concerned here. So Foucault's definition is situated in the context of his reflections on governance from 1978, or throughout the 70s actually. So he sees biopolitics as the way the modern state manages demographic phenomena such as health, hygiene, birth rates, life expectancy, and race, and points to their growing importance since the 19th century. So he thus posits that biopolitics is a specific strategy of power, which is very different, of course, from all the other theories that I just mentioned briefly. 2 years prior, so in 76, he had employed the term to describe a shift in the 19th century, or in the 18th century really, from a sovereign power directed at the human body that makes die and lets live, towards the processes that make live and let die. In other words, according to Foucault, as a new liberal economic system developed at the time, more and more attention is directed at the population and at methods of regulating and making use of the life of the people. The interest is obvious. So, in order to prosper, the state and economy need people to function well. The background for Foucault's reflection on biopolitics is his dealings with the early English utilitarianism. In particular, his observations on the panopticon in the fascinating chapter of Discipline and Punish, his book from 1975. So Jeremy Bentham's architectural models, around 1800, allowing for one person to survey an entire prison or factory without the inmates or workers being able to see their guard, the observer. And that leads to them disciplining themselves, since they are potentially always under control. This is based on Hobbes' vision of humankind, that the state, in order to provide freedom for the highest possible number, must discipline and monitor everybody. So Foucault's concept of the disciplinary society, as he termed it, as analyzed by him in his work on the hospital, the psychiatric clinic, and the prison, implies a positive suppression, so a rationally evidenced care system. In spite of the risks, as with the term power generally in Foucault's oeuvre, this is not bad in itself, not necessarily. Who would want to oppose the state as a provider of health care, education, and infrastructure of all kinds? The benefits of a regulating state are evident, and many societies today provide an exceptional level of justice and well-being for a major portion of the population. The question Foucault raises, however, is how biopolitics, developed to promote and care for life, could turn destructive. His argument operates with a very broad notion of racism, which he contends is used to fragment the continuum of humanity so that the state can, on the premises of biopower, fight lower life in the interest of a healthier and purer life in general. So looking at life in such a biological manner paves the way for killing some individuals in the interest of the population as a whole. An individual deemed racially or otherwise inferior is a threat to the population as a whole and needs to be eradicated in that logic. So this extreme version of biopolitics has been put into practice, and not only by National Socialism. Not as a result of a lack of reason, but rather as one possible logical consequence of enlightenment when it takes the form of instrumentalized reason. Biopower and biopolitics can be used to subdue the body politic and to control the population in the interest of what we hopefully agree are inhumane goals. George Agamben then builds on Foucault's work, but takes a more radical position. By looking at life reductively from a biological or functional perspective, current politics, that is for him in 1995 then, has, in his view, become completely biopolitical. And for him, this means totalitarianism. So he develops this thesis via the notion of the homo sacer, a figure of Roman law, according to which a person is placed outside divine and human law. A homo sacer can therefore be killed, but not sacrificed for religious purposes. Such a being becomes, according to Agamben, bare life. Bare life. Agamben compares that with the concentration camps, which in his view have become the global biopolitical paradigm of our times. He refers to the ancient Greek difference between zoe and bios. Agamben compares that, zoe and bios is the bare fact of life as opposed to life as a form of life. The latter term implies for him a life that is impossible to separate from its form, and which is thus possibilities and potentialities and never simply facts. So this idea of bare life was related then to thanatopolitics, death politics. Achille Bembe then coined the term necropolitics, the power to dictate who may live and who must die. So Agamben has applied these ideas himself to the current COVID-19 crisis and his native Italy. Seeing that Italians are willing to sacrifice practically everything when faced with the risk of getting sick, he deplores that bare life has become the sole criterion in today's society. Referring to Carl Schmitt's notion of the state of exception, Agamben points out that this has become the norm in a purely biological state today. Agamben points to the new devices of monitoring and surveillance, security cameras and cell phones that allow for a level of control that far exceeds any former totalitarian forms. Gilles Deleuze saw this tendency as early as 1992, when he stated that Foucault's disciplinary society transforms with the new digital technologies to control society in which the citizens, by measuring their own life data, constantly control themselves. As is now widely known, practical innovations such as using a debit card, a mobile phone or a smartwatch instead of cash are part of big data, expose us to the depredations of data mining and enable biopolitical surveillance and control over the transparent citizen. Today, the early British utilitarianism Foucault based his ideas on, coupled with American pragmatism, is infinitely empowered by digitalization and makes possible an absolute monitoring and control. Mark Zuckerberg famously spoke of the end of privacy, and this also would imply the end of humankind as we know it. So biopolitics always navigates between rendering life more prosperous, safe and pleasant, and, the other side of the coin, more controlled and modeled in line with interest groups, mostly economics, as always. And while at the start of the COVID-19 measures, people said that nobody can be interested in a lockdown and blocking economy, by now it has become evident that some, already before the biggest, sectors of the economy, IT, service providers and pharma, have made gigantic profits. So this brings us back to health biopolitics. It is no coincidence that Foucault develops his theory from the example of a city in a time of the plague. The plague is the ideal case and condition for the disciplinary society, a perfect trial for the general disciplinarization, as Foucault writes. The parallel to the pandemic situation today is evident. Health is a key factor in biopolitics. A healthy person is functional in the economy or in war. The health industry itself is one of the biggest economic powers, and health, or rather fear of illness, pain and death, is a very powerful tool of manipulation. We are currently experiencing how, via health biopolitics, the state fights a virus to protect the citizens, but also how the virus is used for the transformation of society. An economic transformation towards much greater inequality, and a political transformation pushed by digitalization towards what is, in biopolitical terms, a far more controlling state. So biopolitics designates the strategies that states use to organize the lives of their citizens, not through overt coercion, but through the control of reproduction, welfare and health. The notion has been productively used in the analysis of gender, the body, environment, politics, law, social media and surveillance. It has become more relevant than ever in the context of the global COVID-19 pandemic. And now I pass on to Raili, who will talk a bit more about our framework.
So indeed, because I think everybody is very used to hearing the sentence that COVID-19 was a complete shock. This is a much repeated phrase, but for example, one of the things that you will see tomorrow, part of my research group work on media analysis, when you look at the media representations from March 2020, you can see that it was not so much a shock, but a denial, slow recognition. It was not something that arrived out of the blue. Because what we actually know is that, yes, COVID-19 crisis has been an unprecedented event as a biopolitical crisis. But it is wrong to say that it is completely unprecedented, because we actually, as human beings, have imagined crisis. We have imagined pandemics for centuries. And it is interesting that in the first months of COVID-19, people looked for those narratives. Remember where everybody was reading Defoe? Everybody remembered Decameron. There were all kinds of old texts that were looked up as ways of explaining what was going on. People also were looking for films like Contagion, that was Dustin Hoffman, Steven Soderbergh's Contagion from 2011, because we tried to make sense of what was happening by imaginaries that we had created before. So this is something that we think in the general analysis of the present crisis has not taken into consideration enough. Our ability to imagine crisis, imagine biopolitics, but also imagine alternatives. And this is why we decided to have this event not with the health and virology people, but with the humanities people. We will not only discuss medicine, but we will discuss philosophy and a diverse range of mostly literary representations. Because despite the global nature of the pandemic, the so-called global conversation has remained quite limited. We mostly are talking about things that are published in English, in the English-speaking world, and there is a small number of European philosophers cited again and again. At this conference, our intention is to broaden the scope and enrich the references by talking about texts from a broader range of cultures. In addition to the much expected US and UK, also France and Italy, Germany and China, which we actually hardly ever hear about. Biopolitics is not universal, because the recipes for discipline and control are always culture specific, as are available imaginaries and as are available alternatives. The more cultural spaces we include in our discussion, the more we expand our awareness of the possible correctives to the new states of exception, as well as potentially also possibilities of avoiding the self-perpetuation of the vicious circle of coercion resistance. We need to think of new things. As human societies, we need new ways of thinking, and this is where the humanities are invaluable. I continue to believe, I'm naive, I know. We can look at how people have imagined biopolitical crises in the past to show patterns, to show outliers, and perhaps point to novel imaginaries that have not surfaced in policy analysis yet. After all, they tend to get stuck in the same rut over and over again. This will allow us to discuss what counts as good life and how we preserve good life, even in a crisis context. We hope that in the coming days, we will be able to arrive, if not at good solutions, then at least many good questions. And with this on schedule, we will move on to our first panel.